Hello, it's What the Doodle here, and in today's session I wanted to react to a video by Lex Fridman, who's doing an interview with Pieter Levels, and it's taken from a larger interview that's about 3 hours long, so if you'd like to watch that, do have a look at that. But in this particular clip, it's where they're discussing about the best programming language for web development. So let's have a look.
You're just like one of the top performers from a programming perspective that are still like openly talking about it. But everyone's using PHP. Like if you look, most of the web is still probably PHP and
think
jQuery.
70%. It's because of WordPress, right? Because the blogs are.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
I'm seeing a revival now. People are getting sick of frameworks. Like all the JavaScript frameworks are so like, what do you call it? Like wieldy. Like it takes so much work to just make.
So, okay, yeah, there is some truth to that, and that's generally known as the JavaScript fatigue. But I think we do need some precision here because we need to we need to disambiguate between front end and back end, and we need a little bit of clarity there because when we're talking about PHP, then that runs on the back end. That is a back end web application or web programming language. Whereas JavaScript, you have to be a little bit careful. Now, most people, or generally, JavaScript is obviously it originates on the front end, and when you say JavaScript frameworks, most people would understand that to mean front end front end web applications like single page applications. However, of course, JavaScript can also run on the back end via runtimes such as Node.js, Bun, Dino, and others. And in that case, yes, it can be used on the back end, but just saying JavaScript framework, that's a bit ambiguous. We're not quite sure what they mean, and so therefore, if you just say JavaScript framework, then without actually being explicit, it's hard to say if that is a fair comparison, because are we talking about back-end JavaScript framework as compared to back-end PHP framework or PHP language, for example? Here, I'm not so sure, but generally there is the JavaScript fatigue, which is mentioning, and certainly that's happening at the front end, because obviously the front ends have become quite complex actually because of all the various different front end frameworks that are out there, and as a consequence we have seen the rise of such anti-JavaScript frameworks such as HTMX, which have become quite popular as of recent. But anyway, let's continue.
Maintain this code, and then it updates to a new version. You need to change everything. PHP just stays the same and works.
Yeah.
And
so yes, this is true. There is a lot of high churn in the JavaScript world, or the JavaScript ecosystem. Lots of things are constantly being built and improved, and there are a lot of updates that does happen. And so yeah, there is truth there. Yes, for example, PHP saying it just work isn't entirely true. Of course, because it is a backend language, there is a lot more emphasis on backward compatibility. But then again, if you look at front-end frameworks, we use things like Babel, which are transpilers, and that allows us to take essentially very newer versions of JavaScript, and then we sort of transpile it down to essentially like almost like legacy or vanilla or older JavaScript that can run on some of the oldest browsers. So there is backward compatibility there, and it's to kind of say that is newer versions of or JavaScript are coming out constantly breaking things. I wouldn't completely agree with that. I do appreciate that JavaScript has an exceptionally high amount of rapid development, which means there's a lot of high churn, and so you have to keep things updated. Yes, that is a thing, that is an issue, and that is a challenge. I do agree there, but I would be a little bit careful, and I would temper that and say, we have things like Babel and transpilation, and so therefore it isn't completely as the case that something new will come out and will completely break your code base. That isn't completely true. So I just wanted to balance that. Let's continue.
Can you actually just speak to that stack? You build all your websites, apps, startups, projects, all of that with mostly vanilla HTML.
yeah,
JavaScript with jQuery, PHP, and SQLite.
So that stack I was mostly okay with until I had SQLite, and that's a bit that I guess triggers me a little bit. And the reason being, SQLite, if you look at the actual use cases, even as defined by or as explained by the SQLite creators themselves, it's not really for multi-threaded concurrent users. For that, you want to use a real database. if your web application workload is simply read only, that's probably fine. But to be fair, if your web application has it's transactional based, so you're doing a lot of reads and writes and updates and all this kind of stuff with multiple users, which is what a web application is. It's a client server model, and you have multiple clients connecting to a server. In that case, it really doesn't make a lot of sense, and I would not advocate, and I would not say that to use SQLite. SQLite is good for certain use cases. In a web application that's transactional, that is not entirely a good use case, and you will run into a lot of problems. I do not know how much productivity you'll really save in the long run. So the total cost of ownership, it's not good. I would say this is bad advice. This is terrible advice. Just use a full fat, proper, real database such as Postgres or something. If you have transactional now, unless I caveat that with unless you have your web application and you are absolutely aware, you're 100% sure with certainty that your application that you're building is only going to be read heavy, and you're not going to veer into really high transactional or anything like that. In that case, yeah, perhaps SQLite is fine, but to use that blanket across all projects, I don't agree with this. I think if anyone's out there who's listening and considering that stack and thinking, oh, this is going to make me more productive and it's simpler and all this kind of stuff, this is bad advice. I would temper it and say, or the way I would balance this and say is, if you have to ask what is the use case of your web application, is it mostly read heavy? In that case, perhaps SQLite is an okay data, quote unquote, database to use for this specific use case. But the reality is most web applications are going to be transactional based, and in that case, just use a proper full fat database.
That's a really simple stack, and you get stuff done really fast with that. Can you just speak to the philosophy behind that?
I think it's accidental because that's the thing I knew. Like, I knew PHP, I knew HTML, CSS.
So I just want to pick up on what Lex said, that you can get things done really fast. Again, I'm not sure where he's pulling this from. This is kind of a bit of a red herring, or I don't know. It's really hand wavy because he's saying, oh, I knew PHP and I knew HTML, so therefore, of course, familiarity, the productivity is based on multiple different factors. And of course, if you're unfamiliar with a particular stack or a language, then you're not going to be productive. That's kind of a given. And so to say, oh, it's the reason why it's really fast is because you're using these really simple tools, that's why you're going to be fast. I would push back on that. I would say that's nonsense, because if you're just using that without any libraries, without any frameworks, then you're going to have to reinvent everything. It's going to be the NIH, which is the not invented here syndrome. And you're going to do not only a terrible job of it, but you're going to be really, really far behind. So you're going to lose out on a huge amount of productivity. And of course, as I said, productivity is multifaceted. There are multiple different things you have to consider. One of them is familiarity. Of course, that's, and let's just continue to see what he says.
Because you make websites. And when my startup started taking off, I didn't have time to... I remember putting on my to-do list, like, learn Node.js, because it's important to switch, because this obviously is a much better language than PHP. And
no, I don't agree there. I think they're both terrible languages, if I'm entirely honest. And I would actually say, and I've used both of these languages, and I would say that PHP in this regard for backend, web backend specifically, actually is a better model, because you have to understand the origins of PHP. It was born specifically to serve web applications, or to build out web applications to run on a server to serve requests for web requests. It was literally, the language was literally designed for that. And then of course you have Node.js, which was designed for the front end. It was asynchronous. It was an asynchronous model, which made sense in the client server scope. That kind of made sense because it's on the front end on the browser. And then obviously with Node.js came around, it was sort of an experimental idea. Well, let's see what happens if we put this thing on the server and run it on the back end. And the idea was that you'd have this single language. You don't have to do context switch. If you know one language, you can then apply it on the back end. But the actual model of JavaScript on the back end, and the idea of everything is completely asynchronous and single threaded. this is not exactly a good model. Whereas if you look at PHP, the actual web server model of that is a lot better. It's a lot more robust as well, and it's a lot more forgiving. And it was designed, as I said, it was literally designed. It's almost like an extended DSL, really. That it was designed specifically to serve web requests, whereas Node.js, for example, wasn't. And there are so many other issues with trying to sort of use JavaScript to run on the server end. There's a lot of issues, and people saying, "Oh, it's a better language and it's better." How? I don't think it is. I completely disagree. There might be more hype around it, yes, probably, but I would argue if you put for in terms of a backend language to use, if you were to compare objectively PHP and JavaScript, PHP would win hands down. So I'm not sure where he's getting this information or where he's getting this. It maybe be from the hype. Maybe he's heard, it's kind of like FOMO. He's seen everybody else sort of jump in on that side and thinking, oh, that's probably better or something. Or perhaps it's to do with reputation. PHP has got such a terrible reputation. And because JavaScript has become so popular, maybe he's thinking it's better that way, but it isn't. No, it's a very, very hard disagree here. JavaScript is not better than PHP for web backends. PHP is clearly better than Node.js for backends. That's what I would absolutely argue. There's a lot of technical reasons behind that, and probably should do a separate video to explain those differences. But it is. I've done both, and I would not pick Node.js for a backend. I would pick PHP with that. But combined together, they're still both terrible languages. And anyway, let's continue.
And I never learned it. I never did it. Because I didn't have time. I these things were growing like this, and I was launching more projects, and I never had time. It's like one day, I'll start coding properly, and I never got to it.
I sometimes wonder if I need to learn that stuff. It's still to do enough for me to really learn Node.js or Flask or these.
I mean, I don't know what there is to learn. I mean, it's once you know the language yourself, and then a few of the libraries. It's you pick your library. I don't know. Is there anything you have to really learn? Maybe I'm just a little bit of a sort of grumpy old developer, but I don't entirely think there is much to learn there other than the frameworks, really, or the libraries that you want to use there. Anyway, let's continue.
It's kind of
React, Vue.
React, and it feels like a responsible software engineer should know how to use these, but you can get stuff done so fast with vanilla versions of.
No, this is where I disagree. It depends. So, for example, front-end frameworks such as React and Angular and many other ones, and React, especially React, they've become exceptionally complicated, and there is this argument that when he says you can get these things done exceptionally fast without them, that's not entirely true. And I would point towards front-end single-page application frameworks such as Vue, for example, which I believe is the better out of all of them. So if you were to put all three of the big three frameworks, obviously, technically speaking, React isn't a framework; it's a library. So if you put Angular, you put React, and you put Vue, I would suggest, and this is my opinion, that Vue is actually the better out of all of them, and for a lot of different reasons. But I don't think if you were to put right next to them completely vanilla, so you just write without any of the frameworks / library, and if you were to go head to head, the vanilla, you're not going to be faster. This is absolute nonsense. Not if you're building out a full-on web application, because you will end up having to write so much code that you will be creating your own framework. I'm a terrible one at that as well. So why would you not already use an existing library / framework that has done all of that, all of that for you? Anyway, let's continue. But I completely disagree that when he's saying done so fast, I'm not sure where he's pulling that. This is completely hand waving, and I can attest from actual experience. I have written a complete vanilla without any frameworks and libraries, and also have done it with libraries. And I can tell you, frameworks and libraries will be faster. I don't know. I'm not sure where he's getting this from.
of stuff.
Yeah. It's like software developers if you want to get a job, and there's like, people making stuff like startups. And if you want to be entrepreneur, probably maybe you shouldn't. Right?
I wonder if there's like,
Again, I disagree. So I have experienced both commercially and both in the startup scene as well. And again, as I said, productivity is multifaceted. Familiarity is one of those aspects of that. And to do it completely using vanilla, if you don't know any other frameworks and vanilla is all you know, then yeah, you're going to be faster because obviously you'd have to take some time. There would be some learning curve in order to pick that up. But once you have already paid for that learning curve and you know a framework, I can guarantee you will be way, way, way faster with a framework than without. It's kind of like saying, you need to get from A to B, and you can either walk from A to B, and let's say this is 2 miles or whatever, or you can take a bicycle or a car or a rocket. Well, you know which one's going to be faster. But if you don't know how to ride a bicycle, if you don't know how to drive a car, then of course it's not going to be the same. And walking perhaps for you would be better in that instance. So you have to take that experience, and I hate to say this word, but skill issue. But that has to be part of that factor. You can't just say with ignoring whether you know what level of familiarity you have with those frameworks. You can't just put them all on the same kind of on the same level and then compare them as their equals. They're not, because as I said, you have to have the context of what familiarity or what skills do you have, and if you have skills and you know a particular framework and you have the most familiarity, you're going to be fast. And that also applies, for example, if you, out of the three frameworks, if you're most familiar with framework A, then you're going to be fastest in framework A. That's not a surprise, So anyway, let's continue.
I really want to measure performance and speed. I think there's a deep wisdom in that.
Yeah.
I do think that frameworks and just constantly wanting to learn the new thing, this complicated way of software engineering gets in the way. I'm not sure what to say about that, because definitely, like, you shouldn't build everything from just vanilla JavaScript or vanilla C, for example.
Yeah.
C++, when you're building systems engineering, is like, there's a lot of benefits for a pointer safety and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, but...
What did he just say? Pointer safety in C++? Well, I think Rust would. I think Rust would want to have a word there. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why he's talking about safety and C++ and C, or C++ and sorry, pointer and C++ and safety in the exact same language. Sorry, in the same sentence. I'm sorry. I think. I don't know why. I don't know why he said that. That just made me chuckle. Sorry, as a Rust engineer, that just made me chuckle really a lot. Anyway, let's continue.
It just feels like you can get so much more stuff done if you don't care about how you do it.
Man, this is my most controversial take, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there's frameworks now that raise money. They raise a lot of money, like they raise $50 million, $100 million, $300 million. And the idea is that you need to make the developers, the new developers, like when you're 18 or 20 years old, right? Get them to use this framework and then add a platform to it, like where the framework can... It's open source, but you probably should use the platform, which is paid, to use it. And the cost of the platforms to host it are 1,000 times higher than just hosting it on a simple AWS server or a VPS on DigitalOcean, right? So there's obviously like a monetary incentive here. Like we want to get a lot of developers to use this technology, and then we need to charge them money because they're going to use it in startups, and then the startups can pay for the bills. But it kind of...
Okay, so yes, I do agree here absolutely with Peter, what he's saying here. There are some frameworks which are backed by corporations, and so they then want to use, that's kind of like what we call vendor lock-in, sorry. And yes, there is some of that happens. But again, we need to caveat this. Not all frameworks have corporate backing. If you look at Vue.js, and I hate to keep mentioning Vue.js, Vue.js, for example, you look at Angular, that's backed by Google. You look at React, that's backed by Meta, or used to be called Facebook. But you look at Vue. Vue is the work of originally the work of a single developer, Evan You. And that's not backed by, he was saying, you should be able to just run something on a single AWS server, or just, you should be able to run it without any sort of lock-in, and you absolutely can. With Vue, there is no platform behind. There's no platform that you're locked into that you have to use. When you use that, you're completely free, and you can use PHP with Vue. You can absolutely mix and match those together completely fine. There's no issues here. So there needs to be some balance here. I get what he's saying, and I actually agree with what Pete is saying, but he should also mention that, not all frameworks are backed by corporations, and so therefore there isn't this money incentive and all this kind of stuff where you're locked inside a vendor platform. That isn't the case for everyone. I mean, even React. I mean, there's nothing actually stopping you using React or Angular, compiling it down and hosting it on wherever you want to host it. I'm not sure. Maybe he's talking about things like Vericel and Netlify and some of these other ones that. Actually, I don't know. I don't actually know any specific framework that only runs on a particular platform. I think maybe Cloudflare's Workers or something like that, maybe, or Dino's. I think maybe. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which one. I would like some names actually and specifics here. This is a bit hand wavy for me, but in general, yes, I do agree. Vendor lock-in is bad, and especially corporate-backed frameworks are probably not good because there is some money behind the scenes, and so they would have different motivations. But again, for those for balance sake, I would argue, yes, that is a danger. Yes, it is a challenge. But there are frameworks that aren't backed by corporations. So that needs to be put on the table. Let's continue.
And it destroys the information out there about learning to code, because they pay YouTubers, they pay influencers, developer influencers is a big thing to and same thing what happens with nutrition and fitness or something. Same thing happens in developing. They pay these influencers to promote the stuff, use it, make stuff with it, make demo products with it. And then a lot of people are like, wow, use this. And I started noticing this because when I would ship my stuff, people would ask me, what are you using? I would say, just PHP, jQuery, why does it matter? And people would start kind of attacking me, like, why are you not using this new technology, this new framework, this new thing? And I say, I don't know, because this PHP thing works, and I don't really...
So it's not about him saying, a lot of developers saying, why aren't you using, he's saying he's using PHP and just using, I guess, jQuery or something, or vanilla JavaScript. It's because that once you've learned, because Peter mentions himself that he hasn't actually learned any of the front-end frameworks. I think more specifically front-end frameworks here than anything. And so therefore he's most familiar with just rolling handwritten vanilla HTML. I've done that as well, and I've built enterprise solutions doing that, and it's completely possible. But would I go back to it? Absolutely not. And this is why once you've learned a framework and you've become proficient at it, it's kind of like the reason why people are saying, and other developers are saying to him, why on earth are you doing that by hand? It's like if you know how to drive a car, and then you see somebody walking, and you're trying to get 10 miles down the road or something, and you see some guy walking, and you're saying, why don't you just drive there? And it's like, if that individual doesn't know how to drive a car, that's fine. And that is the situation here. It's not that there is this, that's the reason why people are having that reaction, is because if you see somebody, walking 10 miles barefooted, and you say, dude, what are you doing? You can use a car, you can drive, you'll get there quicker. That is the reaction that's happening here. But because he doesn't know how to drive a car, therefore for him is like, well, this works for me. I don't understand. That is what's going on here. Okay, let's continue.
I'm optimizing for anything, it just works. And I never understood why.
Yeah, sure. I mean, walking barefoot works. You can get from A to B walking, just by walking. That's absolutely possible. Nobody says it doesn't work. It's just that driving a car gets you way there a lot faster. Let's continue.
I understand there's new technologies that are better and there should be improvement, but I'm very suspicious of money, just like lobbying. There's money in this developer framework scene.
Yes, there is money for the corporate ones, but not all frameworks are backed by corporations. So that, I get his suspicion and I understand it, and I know where he's coming from. He is correct to be suspicious for the frameworks that do have a lot of corporate backing. But please don't taint all frameworks with the same brush. There are frameworks that are free from corporations. Okay, let's continue.
Hundreds of millions that goes to ads or influencers or whatever. It can't all go to developers. You don't need so many developers for a framework, and it's open source to make a lot of more money on these startups.
So that's a really good perspective. But in addition to that is when you say better, It's like, can we get some data on the better? Because like,
Yes, we can get data on the better. As I said of that example, if you are trying to get from A to B 10 miles down the road, you can walk there barefooted, you can ride a bicycle there, or you could drive a car down there, and we can absolutely say which one's going to be easier to get there, in terms of time, um, and in terms of time slash effort, which is going to be a lot easier to get across from A to B. And so this isn't a mystery. If you do not know those, if you don't know how to ride a bicycle or you don't know how to drive a car, yes, you're going to have it more. It's going to be far more challenging, and probably it won't be worth it for you. But you do have to pay that tax initially. There is a tax to pay in order to access that technology or that framework or that stack or whatever. So I guess I don't really agree with Lex saying or him being confused here. It's this is the reason why a lot of people or a lot of professional developers, why they when they hear somebody not using a framework or a library, their reaction is exactly the same as anybody else's reaction would be. If you're driving a car and you see somebody barefooted, your reaction is going to be the same. Same reason, like why aren't you driving, essentially. So anyway, let's continue.
I want to know from the individual developer perspective, and then from a team of 5, team of 10, team of 20 developers.
Yeah.
Measure how productive they are in shipping features, how many bugs they create, how many security holes.
PHP was not good at security for a while, but now it's good.
In theory, is it though?
Now it's good.
Now, now as you're saying it, I want to know if that's true, because PHP was just the majority of websites on the internet.
Could be true.
Is it just overrepresented? Same with WordPress.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a reputation that WordPress has a gigantic number of security holes.
WordPress does have a gigantic number of security holes because, number one, WordPress is, if anybody's dived into the actual WordPress code base, you'll see just how much spaghetti code. Everything. If you wanted to have an example of how to write bad code, then that's that's where you would look at. I mean, you have to understand historically where that came from. The reason why PHP gets a bad reputation is a combination of things. When PHP came out, there was a lot of bad education around it. What happened is that PHP essentially lowered the barrier, if you like, the barrier to entry, because it was so simple. The actual model, you just write a bit of code onto some files, and you throw it onto a server, and it just works essentially. So the barrier to entry, and in the way that it simplified web development, or the backend, especially the backend part of it, meant that there was a rush of developers, and it was kind of like the cowboy era. And what then happened was, in that time, people just essentially showed each other. They were just copying from each other, and there was no sort of leadership. There was no organization, and and as a result, what happened is a lot of horrible and terrible bad practices. A lot of cargo culting essentially was copied by each other. So everybody was learning from. It was essentially the blind leading the blind at that time, at that sort of cowboy, Wild West era. A lot of that has now calmed down and has gotten a little bit better, and this is probably another reason to actually advocate for frameworks, because all of the best practices and all that kind of stuff, in terms of security, in terms of efficiency and all that kind of stuff, is baked into those frameworks. So if anything, that's actually an argument for using a framework, ironically, in this instance. So as I was saying, yes, originally that's the history why PHP had so many vulnerabilities and issues. Has it improved? Somewhat, yes, and partly also because of the fact that these frameworks have come along, and so the language has got a little bit better. But I think what's happened is organization. What's happened is these frameworks have distilled down all of the best practices and all the good way or the clean way of writing code and the secure way of writing things, and that's probably a stronger argument for using frameworks, if anything. Let's continue.
I don't know if that's true. I know it gets attacked a lot because it's so popular. It definitely does have security holes, but
that's the other thing I wanted to mention about WordPress. He just reminded me, is that WordPress is essentially a platform, a dynamic platform where most of it is by plugins, and the plugins is essentially remote code. That's external code that you're putting onto the platform, and so it may be the case that WordPress itself, the platform itself, isn't insecure, but because of the fact that there are so many, tens of thousands of frameworks, tens of thousands of plugins out there. You do not know the quality of those, all of those plugins, and that's where the vulnerability lies. And any kind of system architecture where you have, in essence, you're essentially allowing remote code execution. That's what you're doing. It's the entire thing is a massive hole, really. Anyway, let's continue.
Maybe a lot of other systems have security holes as well. Anyway, I just sort of questioning the conventional wisdom that keeps wanting to push software engineers towards frameworks, towards complex.
Yeah.
Like,
well, that's what I just mentioned earlier. I mean, by using a framework, a lot of those safe practices, a lot of those good practices, a lot of those secure practices is baked in already. That's something if you were just starting out, just completely doing vanilla coding in vanilla, then you'd have to build those yourself. You'd have to write those yourself. All of those security measures you'd have to write yourself from scratch. And you might do an okay job of it. You might do a terrible job of it if you try to roll it your own. In some cases, in some extreme cases, you do need to do that. But for the most part, a framework with a lot of people who's contributing behind that, who's dedicating their time and effort to make sure that it's secure, to make sure that it's robust, that's going to be more. I would trust that over than somebody who's just trying to do it themselves. The whole thing about not invented here syndrome. Anyway, let's continue.
Like super complicated sort of software engineering approaches that stretch out the time it takes to actually build a thing.
100%.
So again, it's not this. I don't know where he's getting this bias that it's overly complicated. It takes a long time to build stuff with it. I would argue no. It's not overcomplicated. It's actually hiding complexity. The frameworks are hiding a lot of the complexity that you will have to pay as a developer at some point, and you'll pay that from NIH, which is not invented here syndrome. And it really boils down to familiarity. If you're not familiar in a particular library or framework, yes, that will take you longer. But if you are familiar, you'll do it a lot quicker and a lot safer. So anyway, let's continue.
And it's the same thing with big corporations. Like 80% of the people don't do anything. It's like It's not efficient. And if your benchmark is,
I think that's more an indication of failures of big corporations as opposed to languages and frameworks themselves. Because when you have very large teams, this is why microservices, essentially have become so popular. And actually, microservices is because it is more of an organizational. It's more of an organizational fix, if you like, rather than actually for a technical reason. And the idea that it's inefficient, essentially to point the framework as the issue is wrong here. That's a red herring. Organizations are just, when you have very large organizations, you have efficiency issues anyway. And that's just because of the fact that you have a large organization and you have all of these bodies of people, teams of people. And so that's, I would say, that's not related to the actual language itself anyway, or the framework. Let's continue.
it's like people building stuff that actually gets done, and like for society, right? Like if we want to save time, we should probably use technology that's simple, that's pragmatic, that's like that works, that's not overly complicated, doesn't make your life like a living hell,
And use a framework when it obviously solves a problem, a direct problem that you.
Of course, of course. I'm not saying you should code without a framework. You should use whatever you want, but yeah, I think it's suspicious, and and I think it's suspicious when I talk about it on Twitter. Like there's this army comes out, There's these framework armies.
Yeah,
it's, something my gut tells.
No, again, this is not the framework army, and if Peter's out there and he remotely managed to hear this at some point, I would genuinely tell him, look, sit down, pick a framework, perhaps something like Vue, and learn it end to end. Trust me, Peter, you will change your mind, and you will understand why you're saying this, quote, army of people coming at you. It's because if you see somebody, and I have to go back to that example, if you're driving in your car from A to B and you find somebody else also going from A to B, and you see this other person walking barefoot, you will naturally say to him, what are you doing, man? What on earth are you doing? Why are you walking barefoot? And if he says, well, I just want to get from here to there, you can say, well, you can drive a car. You can drive a car, you'll get there way faster. That is what it is. It's not an army of people that are coming out there because there's some financial incentive behind them. It's because they're just seeing you doing something stupid, well, not stupid. Okay, I take that back. They're seeing something. It's like it just doesn't make sense. There are better ways of doing it. That's why they're coming at you. That's why everybody's coming at you, and that's why I implore you. Please, just go learn a framework. I don't care which one. Of course, I would lean. I'm biased, of course, and I would say go learn Vue, learn it end to end, and then come back, and then you'll be one of those people who are those framework armies that you are blaming everyone else for being. No, people aren't. They're not paid to say that, because their reaction is exactly the same reaction of anyone who's used a framework. It's the same damn thing. It's like, if you, as another example, if you see somebody who's trying to cut down a forest and is using a butter knife, you could theoretically do it. If you have enough time, you could absolutely do it. But you'd have the same gut reaction. You'd be like, why are you not using a chainsaw? So anyway, let's continue.
Tells me.
I want to ask the framework army, what have they built this week? It's the Elon question. What did you do this week?
Yeah, and did you make money with it? Did you charge users? Is it a...
Yes, absolutely. I can attest for that as well. I've used the framework and I've made a ton of money. I'm not going to say specifically what, for legal reasons or many other reasons. But yes, I have built stuff. I have built frameworks in both startups, both commercially and both in startups. And in both instances, I have used a framework / libraries. And I've made a ton of money, and I've helped make companies tons and tons of money. So absolutely, yes. So the idea, would I have done it using vanilla, just hand rolled? Absolutely not. That's just madness. That's the whole walking from one city to another city barefooted madness. You just don't do it, because you don't have to do it. We have better ways of doing it. We have more efficient ways of doing it. We have safer ways of doing it. We have more robust ways of doing it. And it boils down to, this just stinks, essentially, I hate to say it, but this stinks of skill issues. Pieter Levels, for all his brilliance, has massive skill issues. He has not bothered to sit down for a moment and learn. And him not understanding and getting confused why people are coming, and him, as he says, armies of frameworks, and then now they're trying to spin this around saying, well, what have you made money off it? Well, I'm sorry, there's so many web applications out there that are making a ton of money, like ridiculous amounts of money, that work, and so it's nothing to do with the framework, at all. And I do not understand why there's people, for example, tech influencers, for example, like Theo 3T, who are and the Primogen and many others saying that Pieter Levels things are like based and all this kind of stuff, and sort of praising him a lot. I don't understand it. Maybe there are other things that he said that are probably on point. Perhaps, I don't know. I haven't seen that. But in terms of this web language and this sort of anti-framework, anti-library kind of a stance, I don't think he is well equipped to have an opinion on that, because he doesn't know, he hasn't learnt a framework, and then he's attacking frameworks. That's like someone who doesn't know how to drive a car saying, oh, I'm sorry, I don't get why you're driving a car. This walking barefoot to another city works for me. Why should I learn it? Why should I learn how to drive a car? Complete nonsense, utter nonsense. Anyway, let's continue.
Real business, and yeah.
Okay, well, that's the end of that video, or that clip for that video. So in summary, essentially, as I mentioned, number one, you need to differentiate between the back end and front end. I would pick PHP over Node.js, but I still think they're both terrible languages. The whole idea about this whole video, like in terms of like being anti-framework, makes no sense. I get it. Some other frameworks do have corporate backing, and you have to be wary of that. That's fine. That's completely valid in that point. Most of that, you can use simple tools. That's completely fine. Don't use SQLite, please. Please don't use SQLite. Terrible advice there, unless you have a very, very, very niche case, which is where your web application is mostly read-only. And of course, there is no, just learn a framework. Just learn a framework. Honestly, you don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. And no, doing it completely vanilla is not going to be faster. But it does mean that you do have to sit down and you do have to learn, there is that initial tax. But the productivity game, the return on investment that you'll get is so huge. I've done both vanilla and done framework, And I can tell you the same as everyone else who's been through that experience, who will tell you the same thing. You wouldn't want to go backwards. Why would you want to go backwards? It makes no sense. Anyway, I'll leave that here, and until the next time, I'll see you on the next one.